Imagine a parlour lit low, gas lamps turned down until the room holds only a soft amber half-light, thick velvet curtains drawn tight against a London evening already gone fully dark outside.
A round table sits at the centre of the room, polished wood gleaming faintly in what little light remains. Around it, perhaps 6 or 7 people are seated, hands resting lightly on its surface, fingertips just touching their neighbours on either side. No one speaks above a whisper. Somewhere beneath the hush, you can hear a clock ticking on the mantel, and beneath that, quieter still, the small private sound of someone's held breath. This is a Victorian séance, and it's about to begin. We're a long way now from the mud brick homes and the medieval cottages and the wooden ships we visited together on other evenings. This is the 19th century, an age of railways and telegraphs and gaslighting, an age that, on its surface, seems to belong far more to our own world than to the ancient or medieval ones. And yet, in exactly this era of steam engines and scientific societies, an entire culture grew up around the belief that the dead were not, in fact, entirely gone. That with the right conditions, the right sensitive person, the right quiet room, a voice from beyond the grave might answer, if only you knew how to ask. Tonight we're going to sit down at that table together, slowly, the way every séance began, with patience, with hushed anticipation, with candles burning low and nerves held carefully in check. We'll learn how an entire respectable middle-class society came to believe that rapping sounds on a table leg might be messages from the departed. We'll learn about the mediums who built careers, and in some cases genuine fame, out of this belief, and about the strange, careful rituals of grief that surrounded Victorian death long before any séance table was ever set. So let your shoulders settle, the way a nervous sitter's shoulders settled once the lamps were finally turned down low, and let's step together into a darkened Victorian parlour, where, for one evening at least, the living and the dead were believed to sit down at the very same table. To understand why Victorians grew so fascinated with communicating with the dead, you first have to understand just how close death sat to ordinary Victorian life, far closer, in most respects, than it sits to our own. Mortality rates through the 19th century, even as medicine slowly began to improve, remained strikingly high by any modern standard. Infectious disease moved through crowded, rapidly industrializing cities with terrible efficiency. Childbirth carried real and constant danger for both mother and infant. Infant and childhood mortality touched nearly every family, wealthy and poor alike, in a way that meant almost no Victorian adult reached midlife without having buried at least one child, one sibling, one parent taken well before what we would now consider old age. Death, in short, was not a distant, occasional visitor to Victorian households. It was a regular, expected, deeply woven presence, arriving again and again across the span of an ordinary life. This constant proximity to death produced an entire, elaborate culture of mourning, governed by careful, widely understood social rules that dictated exactly how grief should be publicly expressed, for how long and in what specific manner, depending on your relationship to the deceased. Widows, most famously, were expected to observe an extended period of formal mourning, often stretching well over a year, moving through carefully defined stages, from deep mourning, marked by plain black clothing of dull, non-reflective fabric, through half mourning, when small touches of grey, lavender or mauve were gradually permitted back into a wardrobe otherwise still dominated by black. Queen Victoria herself, famously, remained in mourning for her husband Prince Albert for the remainder of her own long life, a public example of grief's proper, sustained expression that shaped and reinforced the wider culture's expectations enormously. Mourning jewellery became a genuinely widespread and significant part of this culture. Small, deeply personal objects meant to keep a departed loved one close in a tangible, wearable way. Lockets containing a small woven curl of the deceased's hair, sometimes worked into intricate patterns, flowers, wreaths, or initials, braided by hand with real skill and real patience. Brooches and rings set with jet, a deep black polished stone considered appropriately sombre for mourning wear, sometimes inscribed with a departed person's name or dates, sometimes containing, beneath a small glass window, a lock of hair or a tiny painted miniature portrait. And there was, perhaps most strikingly to modern sensibilities, the practice of post-mortem photography, a widespread and, for its time, entirely respectable custom of photographing the recently deceased, very often infants and young children, sometimes posed to appear peacefully asleep, sometimes photographed alongside grieving family members in a final, formal family portrait. This was never treated as macabre by the Victorians who practiced it. For many families, particularly those of more modest means who might never otherwise have afforded a photograph of a child who died too young, it was simply the only image, the only physical trace they would ever possess of a beloved face already gone. Given all of this, given a culture that had built such an elaborate, careful, loving infrastructure around remembering and honouring the dead, it should come as no great surprise that when a movement arose promising the dead could still, in some real sense, speak back, it found an eager, genuinely hopeful audience waiting for it. The movement that would come to be called spiritualism traces its most widely recognised origin to a small farmhouse in Hydesville, in upstate New York, in the spring of 1848. And though we've crossed the Atlantic for this particular starting point, the movement that grew from it would sweep through Victorian Britain with extraordinary speed and would become every bit as much a British as an American phenomenon within just a few short years. Two young sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, reported that their family's house was disturbed by mysterious rapping and knocking sounds. Sounds that, according to the sisters, could be made to respond intelligently to questions. A single knock for no, a specific pattern for yes, and eventually a more elaborate system allowing longer, more detailed communication by counting through the letters of the alphabet. The sisters claimed the sounds came from the spirit of a man who had, they said, been murdered and buried in the cellar of the house some years before, and the story, sensational and immediately compelling, spread with remarkable speed through American newspapers and before very long across the ocean into Britain as well. The Fox sisters themselves would go on to become genuine celebrities, touring, demonstrating their abilities before paying audiences, and their case would remain hotly debated for decades, eventually including a dramatic public confession from one of the sisters, many years later, admitting the rappings had been produced by the deliberate cracking of joints, most likely the toes, against the floorboards, a confession she would later partially retract under pressure from believers who had built entire careers and entire belief systems around the movement she had helped begin. But by the time that confession arrived, decades on, the movement itself had long since outgrown its two original young founders entirely, spreading into a genuine, widespread cultural phenomenon that would count among its believers scientists, aristocrats, and eventually even members of royal households. What made the timing so significant was how neatly spiritualism's core promise that communication across the boundary of death remained possible through the right methods arrived precisely when an entire grieving Victorian society was primed to want exactly that promise to be true. A society that had already built lockets from a dead child's hair and commissioned final photographs of a departed infant was, in a very real sense, already reaching toward exactly the kind of continued connection spiritualism now offered to provide, formally, ritually, and crucially, interactively, allowing the living not merely to remember the dead but to speak with them directly. Let's return now to that darkened Victorian parlour where we began this evening, because the specific, careful preparation of a séance room deserves real attention, since it tells us a great deal about how seriously this whole practice was taken by the ordinary families who gathered around these tables. A proper séance, according to the manuals and guides that circulated widely through spiritualist circles, required careful attention to atmosphere and condition. Lighting was dimmed deliberately, sometimes to near total darkness, sometimes down to the faint red or amber glow of a single covered lamp, and this dimness was justified within spiritualist belief through the theory that the delicate spiritual energies required for communication, sometimes described using the borrowed scientific-sounding term of a magnetic or psychic force, were disrupted or dispersed by bright light, much the way an overexposed photograph might blur or wash out a faint image. This explanation carried real weight for Victorian believers living through an age deeply impressed by the genuine rapid progress of actual science, electricity, chemistry, the emerging field of photography itself, and spiritualism very deliberately borrowed this scientific vocabulary, describing its own practices in terms that felt modern and rigorous rather than superstitious, an important distinction for a movement trying to establish itself as a legitimate field of investigation rather than simple folk belief. The sitters themselves, the ordinary people gathered around the table, were arranged with real care, typically seated in a circle, hands linked or resting lightly upon the table's surface, a physical configuration understood within spiritualist theory to combine and concentrate each individual's own contribution of psychic energy into a single, stronger collective force, sufficient in theory to allow a spirit to manifest some detectable sign of its presence. A period of quiet, often accompanied by soft singing or humming, sometimes a specific hymn, was frequently used to settle the group's nerves and establish the right calm, receptive mood before any communication was attempted. Not entirely unlike, in its underlying function, the quiet, settling ritual that opened a medieval household's evening prayers, a different vocabulary entirely, but a remarkably similar instinct toward careful, deliberate transition from ordinary daily bustle into a more focused, more spiritually attentive state. At the centre of all of this sat the medium, the individual understood to possess a particular sensitivity or gift, allowing them to serve as the conduit through which spirit communication became possible, and it's to the medium and to the extraordinary range of methods that developed around this central figure that we'll turn next. The Victorian medium occupied a genuinely unusual social position, one that opened, particularly for women, a rare and striking path to public prominence, income, and influence in a society that otherwise offered women remarkably few such opportunities. Mediumship was understood, within spiritualist belief, to come in several distinct forms, each carrying its own particular method and its own particular claims. Mental mediums, sometimes called trance mediums, entered what was described as an altered state of consciousness. sometimes appearing to sleep, sometimes speaking in an unfamiliar voice or manner entirely different from their ordinary waking personality, understood to indicate that a spirit had taken temporary control of the medium's own body and vocal apparatus in order to deliver a message directly to the assembled sitters. These trance performances could be genuinely striking events to witness, and surviving accounts describe sitters deeply moved, sometimes to tears, by messages delivered in this way, particularly when the message contained some specific, private detail about a departed loved one that the medium, as far as the grieving sitter could tell, had no ordinary way of knowing. Physical mediums, by contrast, were understood to produce tangible, observable phenomena during a séance rather than, or in addition to, spoken messages, and this category included an extraordinarily wide range of reported effects. Tables that rapped, tilted, or genuinely rose from the floor. Musical instruments left within the darkened room that seemed to play on their own. Cool breezes felt moving through a sealed room with no apparent source. Objects that moved or were thrown across the space without visible human contact. And in the most dramatic and most widely reported cases, the production of what was called ectoplasm, a strange substance described in period accounts as resembling gauze, mist, or a pale, semi-solid material, said to emanate from a medium's body, most often the mouth, and to gradually take shape into a recognizable form, a face, a hand, occasionally an entire figure, understood to represent the departed spirit attempting to manifest itself physically enough to be seen and even touched by the sitters gathered in the darkened room. Some mediums became genuinely famous across Britain and beyond for their particular specialties. Daniel Douglas Home, a Scottish-born medium, achieved extraordinary celebrity across Europe through the middle decades of the century, reportedly demonstrating levitation of both objects and, according to numerous eyewitness accounts, of his own body, before audiences that included scientists, aristocrats, and members of several European royal families, and remarkably, unlike many of his contemporaries, he was never conclusively exposed as a fraud, despite considerable, determined effort by skeptical investigators throughout his long career. Florence Cook, a younger medium working somewhat later in the century, became famous for producing a fully materialized spirit form she called Katie King, a phenomenon investigated at length by prominent scientists of the day, producing a genuinely fierce and lasting public controversy over whether the materialized figure was truly spiritual in origin, or was, as skeptics increasingly suspected, the medium herself or a confederate dressed and disguised, moving through the darkened room while Cook's own restrained body remained, as far as the sitters could tell, accounted for elsewhere. Not every Victorian household could afford or wish to arrange a full formal séance with a professional medium presiding, and a rich body of simpler, more domestic practice grew up alongside the grander, more theatrical performances of famous mediums, practices that ordinary families could and did attempt in their own parlours on any ordinary evening. Table tipping, sometimes called table turning, represented perhaps the most widespread and accessible of these home practices, requiring nothing more elaborate than an ordinary table and a small group of participants willing to sit quietly around it, with fingertips resting lightly on its surface, waiting patiently for movement, a tilt, a rap, a slow rotation, understood to represent an attempted spirit communication. The practice swept through Victorian Britain with remarkable speed and breadth during the early years of the spiritualist movement's popularity, drawing participants from every level of society, and it produced Alongside its genuine believers, an equally passionate community of skeptical investigators determined to explain the phenomenon through entirely physical means, most notably through the concept of what became known as the ideomotor effect. Small, genuinely unconscious muscular movements, produced without any deliberate intention on the part of the sitters themselves, gradually accumulating across a whole circle of hands into a movement large enough to tip or turn an entire table. Alongside table tipping grew the use of the planchette, a small heart-shaped or triangular device fitted with a pencil, which sitters rested their fingertips upon lightly while it was allowed, in spiritualist belief, to be guided by spirit influence across a sheet of paper, producing written messages, sometimes coherent words and sentences, sometimes fragmentary or symbolic marks requiring careful interpretation by those present. This device would, later in the century and increasingly into the following one, evolve into the more elaborate talking board, printed with the full alphabet, numbers, and simple words like yes and no, allowing a small pointer, guided by the same light collective touch, to spell out messages letter by letter without requiring a written record to be produced and interpreted afterward. These simpler home practices carried a particular intimate emotional weight precisely because of their domestic, accessible nature. A grieving mother did not need to travel to a professional medium's parlor, arrange an appointment and pay a fee in order to attempt contact with a recently lost child. She could, with a handful of family members gathered around her own kitchen table on an ordinary evening, attempt the very same thing, in her own home, surrounded by the same familiar furniture and familiar faces that had once, not so very long before, surrounded the child she hoped to reach. Alongside table tipping and the planchette grew another quieter, more solitary practice that deserves its own brief mention, because it reveals a slightly different, more private texture to Victorian spirit communication than the crowded, dramatic séance room we've mostly been sitting in tonight. Automatic writing involved a single individual, pen or pencil in hand, deliberately relaxing their conscious control over the writing hand, allowing it, according to spiritualist belief, to be guided instead by an external spirit intelligence, producing words, sentences, sometimes entire lengthy messages the writer themselves claimed no conscious awareness of composing. Some practitioners reported the experience as genuinely involuntary, watching their own hand move across the page as though it belonged to someone else entirely, while critics, including a good number of contemporary psychologists beginning to take real professional interest in exactly this kind of phenomenon, offered a more mundane explanation rooted in the same ideomotor principle, already suspected behind table-tipping small, genuine, unconscious muscular impulses shaped by the writer's own hopes, memories, and half-buried thoughts, producing text the conscious mind sincerely believed it had played no active part in creating. Slate writing offered a related, somewhat more theatrical variation, particularly popular among certain professional mediums, involving a small handheld chalkboard, sometimes two slates bound together with a small fragment of chalk sealed between them, held beneath a séance table or otherwise kept from the sitter's direct view for a period of time, after which a message, purportedly written by the spirit itself using the enclosed chalk fragment, would be revealed upon the slate's surface. This particular practice drew especially intense and especially successful scrutiny from skeptical investigators and stage magicians, who demonstrated repeatedly, and quite convincingly, the numerous mechanical methods by which a slate could be secretly pre-prepared, swapped, or written upon through simple sleight of hand while sitters' attention was carefully directed elsewhere. And yet, exposed again and again across dozens of individual cases, slate writing nonetheless persisted as a popular séance feature for a remarkably long stretch of the movement's history, sustained, like so much of what we've discussed this evening, less by the strength of its evidence than by the strength of the hope it continued to answer. One of the most visually striking developments to emerge from Victorian spiritualism was the practice of spirit photography, a phenomenon made possible by the genuine technological novelty of photography itself, still a relatively young and to many ordinary Victorians genuinely mysterious technology through much of the movement's peak popularity. Spirit photographers claim the ability to capture, on the same photographic plate as a living sitter, a faint ghostly secondary image, understood to represent a departed loved one, making themselves visible, if only briefly and imperfectly, to the camera's mechanical eye in a way believers held was often impossible for ordinary human vision to achieve directly. William Mumler, working in the United States, became the most famous and most controversial early practitioner of this particular art, producing photographs that showed sitters accompanied by faint translucent figures standing or hovering nearby, sometimes identified by grieving clients as unmistakably resembling a specific departed relative. One of Mumler's most famous images purported to show the grieving widow of a recently assassinated American president, accompanied by the faint ghostly figure of her late husband standing protectively behind her, an image that circulated widely and added enormously to public fascination with the practice. Spirit photography spread quickly to Britain as well, where practitioners produced their own versions of the phenomenon for an eager, hopeful clientele, and the practice inevitably drew intense scrutiny from skeptical investigators, photographic experts, and eventually the courts themselves. Since photographic double exposure, a deliberate technical trick involving exposing a single plate twice, once with the sitter alone and once with a hidden accomplice, or a prepared image of the desired spirit, was well understood by knowledgeable photographers of the era and was repeatedly demonstrated as a plausible, entirely mundane explanation for the striking ghostly images being produced. And yet, despite this mounting technical skepticism, and despite genuine legal proceedings brought against some of the most prominent spirit photographers on charges of fraud, the practice retained a devoted following for decades, sustained above all by the simple, deeply human fact that for many bereaved clients, the resulting photograph, however it had actually been produced, offered something they desperately wanted and could find nowhere else: a final image, however faint and uncertain, of a face they feared they might otherwise entirely forget. It would be incomplete and somewhat dishonest to walk through this whole evening without giving proper attention to the substantial, serious skepticism that ran alongside spiritualism's popularity throughout the Victorian era, because the movement was never universally accepted, even at the height of its cultural influence, and some of the era's most careful, rigorous minds devoted real, sustained effort to investigating its claims. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882, represented perhaps the most significant and most genuinely serious attempt to bring rigorous scientific method to bear on spiritualist claims, drawing together scientists, philosophers, and other prominent intellectual figures of the day who approached the question with real intellectual seriousness rather than either credulous acceptance or dismissive mockery. The Society conducted extensive investigations into mediums, séance phenomena, and reported cases of what would today be called extrasensory perception or hauntings, and its findings across many individual cases were genuinely mixed. exposing numerous mediums as straightforward frauds employing detectable physical tricks, while, in a smaller number of cases, leaving investigators genuinely uncertain, unable to identify a clear mundane explanation for what they had personally witnessed under reasonably controlled conditions. Stage magicians, too, took a particular professional interest in exposing spiritualist trickery, reasoning, with real justification, that their own specialized knowledge of misdirection, sleight of hand, and mechanical deception equipped them uniquely well to identify exactly how a medium's seemingly impossible effects were actually being produced. Numerous prominent mediums were caught, sometimes quite dramatically, employing hidden confederates, concealed mechanical devices for producing raps and table movement, and carefully staged materializations using ordinary theatrical props, gauze, luminous paint and simple costume, revealed under conditions of unexpected light or a sitter's sudden unauthorized grasp. And yet it's worth noting, with real fairness to everyone involved in this whole complicated story, that exposure of individual fraudulent mediums rarely dampened the wider movement's overall popularity for very long, precisely because spiritualism, for its most devoted believers, was never really only about any single medium's individual credibility. It was about a much larger, much more emotionally significant hope that death itself might not represent the absolute, final severing it appeared to be, and that hope, once genuinely held, proved remarkably resilient against even quite compelling evidence of fraud in any particular individual case. Beyond the séance rooms and the famous mediums and the ongoing public controversy over fraud, spiritualism developed, for a great many ordinary Victorian believers, into something closer to an actual organised faith, complete with its own churches, its own regular congregational meetings, and its own theological framework offering comfort and structure well beyond the dramatic, occasional excitement of an individual séance. Spiritualist churches held regular services, often incorporating hymns, prayers, and a sermon much as any conventional Christian church might, but typically also including a period devoted to what was called clairvoyance or spirit communication, during which a medium standing before the assembled congregation would deliver messages understood to come from departed loved ones connected to specific individuals present, offering comfort, reassurance, and, very often, small, deeply personal details intended to convince the recipient of the message's genuine authenticity. This blending of familiar conventional religious structure with the movement's distinctive additional element of direct spirit communication allowed spiritualism to feel, for many of its adherents, less like a radical departure from mainstream Victorian Christianity than like a natural, welcome extension of it, offering exactly the kind of ongoing, tangible connection to the departed that more traditional religious frameworks, for all their genuine comfort, could not quite provide in the same immediate, interactive way. This communal, congregational dimension of spiritualism deserves real emphasis because it tells us something important about what the movement actually offered its followers beyond the simple, dramatic thrill of witnessing an apparent supernatural event. It offered ongoing community, a regular gathering of people who had all suffered similar losses and who could speak about those losses and about their continuing hope of connection beyond them in a setting that did not require the careful, restrained public performance of grief that wider Victorian mourning etiquette otherwise demanded of everyone at nearly every other moment of ordinary daily life. Within a spiritualist congregation, grief itself, and the persistent, entirely human hope that death might not be truly final, could be spoken about directly, openly and regularly, among people who understood exactly what that hope felt like from the inside, because they carried it themselves. Let's slow down here for a moment, gently, and sit with something that runs quietly beneath everything we've discussed so far tonight, because I think it matters more than any individual medium's particular trick or any particular scientific investigator's particular finding. Nearly every single person who ever sat down at a Victorian séance table did so carrying real, genuine grief. A mother who had lost a young child to fever, a widow whose husband had been taken by illness or accident far too early, a parent who had buried more than one infant before that child had ever had the chance to properly grow. This was, as we discussed at the very beginning of this evening, simply the ordinary texture of Victorian life, loss arriving again and again across an ordinary lifetime, and spiritualism, whatever else it was, whatever fraud and trickery genuinely ran alongside its more sincere and more sensitive practitioners, offered these grieving people something that very little else in their world reliably offered them: a structured, hopeful, actively participatory way of continuing to hold on to a relationship that death had otherwise, by every ordinary appearance, permanently and completely severed. Consider for a moment what it might have actually felt like to be that grieving mother, sitting in a darkened parlour, hands resting on a polished table alongside strangers and family members alike, listening for a single soft rap that might, just might, be her own child reaching back across whatever boundary separated the living from the dead. Whether or not the rap she eventually heard was genuinely spiritual in origin, or was, as so many skeptical investigators concluded across so many individual cases, the product of a clever medium's hidden mechanical device or a sitter's own unconscious muscular tension, the feeling in that darkened room, the held breath, the desperate hope, the small, private flicker of comfort at hearing any sound at all in answer to a silently, achingly asked question, was entirely, unmistakably real, whatever its ultimate cause turned out to be. This is, I think, the deepest and most honest way to understand this whole strange, fascinating chapter of Victorian history. It was never really, at its emotional core, primarily about proving or disproving the existence of an afterlife through careful, rigorous investigation, however seriously some of its participants, on both sides of that argument, genuinely approached that particular question. It was about grief looking for somewhere to go, in an era that offered grief remarkably few other outlets, and finding in the darkened parlour and the polished table, and the patient, careful ritual of the séance, a place, however uncertain its ultimate foundation, to sit quietly for an evening with the people it had lost. Let's walk, one final time tonight, through a complete Victorian séance from beginning to end, the way we've walked through a complete evening in a medieval cottage, and a complete night in a haunted castle, and a complete crossing aboard an old wooden ship in our earlier evenings together. The invitation arrives perhaps by way of a friend or a relative who has attended a similar gathering before and found it genuinely moving, and the small party arrives at the appointed house as dusk settles fully into evening. They're shown into the parlour, where the medium, perhaps already seated, perhaps arriving only after the guests have settled themselves, greets them with quiet, careful warmth, explaining gently what the evening might hold, and reminding everyone present of the importance of a calm, patient, receptive state of mind. The gas lamps are turned low. Curtains are drawn fully closed against whatever light might otherwise filter in from the street outside, The circle forms around the table, hands resting lightly on its polished surface or joined loosely with the neighbours on either side. A period of quiet settles over the room, sometimes accompanied by soft humming or a familiar hymn sung low, and the medium's own manner begins gradually to change, breathing slowing, posture shifting, perhaps a faint tremor passing through her hands as whatever state of trance or heightened sensitivity she has cultivated over years of practice begins to take hold. And then, into that thick, expectant silence, the first sign arrives, a single soft rap against the underside of the table, or a faint, cool movement of air across an anxious sitter's cheek. Or, if the evening is destined to be a particularly dramatic one, the medium's own voice, altered, unfamiliar, beginning to speak words that are not, she and her audience both believe, entirely her own. Questions are asked, carefully, respectfully, by whichever sitter's departed loved one seems to be responding. Answers come back, sometimes clear and specific enough to produce audible gasps and quiet tears around the table, sometimes fragmentary and uncertain, requiring careful, hopeful interpretation from the grieving family member, most invested in believing the connection genuine. And eventually, after minutes or sometimes hours of this careful, patient exchange, the medium's own energy visibly begins to fade, the trance loosening its hold, and the session draws gently to its close. The lamps turned back up, the ordinary Victorian parlour reasserting itself around a group of people who have just spent an evening, by their own sincere belief, in the company of the dead. Whatever we, looking back now with all the distance of more than a century, ultimately conclude about what genuinely happened in rooms like this one, again and again, across thousands of ordinary Victorian parlours, there is no reasonable doubt at all about what the people gathered around those tables felt while it was happening. Hope, fear, a trembling, desperate kind of comfort, and for at least the length of that single quiet evening, the profound, aching sense that the boundary between themselves and everyone they had ever loved and lost had, however briefly, however uncertainly, grown just a little bit thinner. As we begin to bring this evening gently toward its own close, it's worth stepping back one final time to consider what spiritualism, across its entire remarkable Victorian heyday, actually accomplished for the society that embraced it so widely and so passionately, regardless of how many of its individual claims ultimately withstood careful scrutiny. It gave grieving people permission, in an era of otherwise strict, carefully regulated mourning etiquette, to speak openly and repeatedly about the people they had lost, to actively seek them out rather than simply, passively enduring their absence. It gave women, in a society that offered them remarkably few paths to public influence, income, or intellectual authority, a genuine and widely respected avenue toward exactly that kind of prominence, since the great majority of celebrated mediums were women, operating with a level of independent public voice and financial autonomy that few other Victorian professions permitted them. It gave an entire culture, already deeply comfortable with mourning jewellery and post-mortem photography and elaborate, careful funeral custom, one further, actively participatory way of maintaining connection with its dead, a way that felt, to its many sincere believers, not like superstition at all, but like a genuinely modern, almost scientific extension of exactly the same instinct that had always driven every culture we visited together on this show, back through medieval Europe, back through ancient Egypt, back through every candlelit room and every quiet fireside we've sat beside in earlier evenings, the same deep, patient, endlessly human refusal to simply let the people we love disappear entirely into silence. So let the gas lamps in that Victorian parlour come back up now, slowly, gently, the same careful way they were turned low at the very start of the evening we've just walked through together. Let the polished table settle back into its ordinary, unremarkable stillness, its brief evening of rapping and tilting and quiet, trembling hope folded now into memory, into the same kind of story that will be told and retold softly at the next gathering and the one after that. You don't need to listen for any rap or knock tonight. Whatever hope or grief or quiet longing first drew people to darkened parlours like this one, all across Victorian Britain, it has already done its patient work this evening, the way it always did, offering, for however brief and uncertain a stretch of time, the deep comfort of feeling less alone with a loss too heavy to carry entirely by yourself. If this quiet evening in a Victorian séance room helped carry you towards sleep, you're welcome to leave a gentle tap of a thumb before your own eyes close the rest of the way, and let us know in the comments which old world or which quieter corner of history you'd like us to visit next. And if you'd like to keep returning to evenings like this one, consider following the show so the next lamp is already turned low and waiting for you, whenever you're ready to sit down again. For now, though, none of that needs to happen yet. There is only the last soft glow of gas lamplight settling over an empty parlour, and the old, patient, endlessly human hope, carried forward from 100 darkened rooms just like this one, that love, once given, is never quite as easily lost as the silence afterward makes it feel. Rest now. Whatever waits on the other side of tonight's dark can wait a little longer still. Morning will come gently, the way it always has,